Welcome to the Resilient Performance Podcast. I'm your host, Doug Kachijian, and today I'm joined by Jack Murphy. Jack Murphy is an 8-year Army Special Operations veteran who served as a sniper and team leader in 3rd Ranger Battalion and as a senior weapons sergeant on a military freefall team in 5th Special Forces Group. Having left the military in 2010, he graduated from Columbia University with a BA in Political Science. Murphy is the author of Reflexive Fire, Target Deck, Direct Action, and numerous nonfiction articles about weapons, tactics, special operations, terrorism, and counter-terrorism. He has appeared in documentaries, national television, and syndicated radio. I've been following Jack's online news platform, SOFREP, for a while now, and having been privy to how special operations missions and national security initiatives are conducted, I found SOFREP's reporting to be more accurate and politically moderate than what one usually encounters in more established media outlets. National security and counterterrorism are highly politicized and highly polarizing topics. It can be difficult to evaluate these topics, especially when presented with false dichotomies and either-or scenarios that don't effectively encapsulate the full range of options. Security policy is a great lens through which to appreciate complexity, as the unintended consequences of some initiatives often further muddy the waters. Hey, Jack, thanks so much for coming on. You've got a pretty varied background, so I wanted to begin by having you talk a little bit about your Army Special Forces career and just kind of, for the people who aren't informed about it, just talk about what the Army Special Forces mission is, what makes it unique, particularly with regard to the degree to which you guys were exposed and vulnerable, maybe compared to a unit that works completely by itself.
Yeah, so I started off in the Ranger Regiment, and then I went over to Special Forces in, 2006. I started the Q course and then finished in 2007 and went to 5th Special Forces Group. So, Special Forces mission is primarily, it's considered to be unconventional warfare, although we've kind of deviated away from that over, the last maybe 20, 30 years. I mean, you could even look back to the 1980s and see that SF started to transition into what we call foreign internal defense instead of unconventional warfare. I think largely because FID is seen as being safer and more politically acceptable, to say, oh, well, we're going to go to XYZ country and we're going to train the indigenous troops, a friendly nation. We're going to train their military. That's kind of an easy mission to get, as opposed to unconventional warfare. That doesn't come along too often, where you're sent into a country to undermine the government and overthrow it, which was something that we did in like the Jedburghs did in World War II, and the 5th Special Forces Group did in Afghanistan in 2001 with the Northern Alliance. So those are some examples of Special Forces missions. If you wanted to get technical about it, there's a handful of different missions that Special Forces is responsible for. Counter-proliferation is on there, special reconnaissance is on there, direct action is on there, and then foreign internal defense, unconventional warfare. And sometimes these missions, they go through name changes. You know how it is. New officers get in there. They want to call unconventional warfare something else. They want to call it special warfare or whatever the flavor of the month is. But that's the gist of it. What makes it a little bit different than some of the other units, like when I was in Ranger Battalion, we would deploy a pretty sizable amount of guys. You're organized as a infantry battalion, company, platoon. You have pretty solid support frontwards and back, and you're rolling out pretty heavy. Pretty heavily armed with a good amount of guys. That if you get into a dust up with the enemy, I mean, there's not too much you're not going to be able to handle. Contrary to that, a Special Forces team is organized for unconventional warfare into a 12-man team where you have 2 MOSs each on the team. So there's 2 weapons sergeants, 2 communications sergeants, 2 medical sergeants, 2 engineers. There is 1 intelligence sergeant, and then there's a team sergeant. Then there's a warrant officer who also serves as the assistant detachment commander, and there's a captain who serves as the detachment commander. So that's, in a nutshell, how an ODA, an Operational Detachment Alpha, is structured. And, they roll out with partner forces a lot of the times. There's not too much, ODAs usually don't do anything unilaterally. They're working by, with, and through partner forces in various parts of the world. So does that pretty much answer the question?
Yeah, totally. And, when I was in the military, I never worked directly. Like, I was never embedded with a special forces unit, but had a tremendous amount of respect for you guys because for the most part, we stayed at pretty secure bases or forward operating bases, and we'd go in and pick somebody up and then go back to eating ice cream at the cafeteria. Whereas you guys to gain the trust of the local population, you're basically doing ground level diplomacy, and you had to make yourselves really exposed and vulnerable to gain that population's trust. And if you walk around with your guard up, armed to the teeth all the time, you're never going to gain that trust and empower the local population. So I always thought that you guys had the hardest job with the least amount of support and the least amount of resources, and I think sometimes almost too much was asked of you guys. But you transitioned from doing that into starting this company called SOFREP. So I want you to talk a little bit about what SOFREP is and what the impetus for getting into journalism essentially was, because I think that there's probably a little bit of an issue with how the journalism community reports on some national security policy issues and some military operations. I feel like you guys are actually setting a new trend for journalism in that space right there. And then the other question I wanted to incorporate into that is, how do you guys balance the need for transparency with operational security? Because you're trying to paint a clearer picture to the public without obviously endangering anybody that's doing these missions. So could you go ahead and maybe just try to tie all those things together, if that's possible?
Yeah, that's a huge question, and I'll try to answer as briefly as I can. How I got into journalism and how I ended up being one of the founders of this company is a very serpentine path, of course. I got out of the Army and I had this idea initially that I wanted to write actually an action-adventure novel. And so I started writing this book, and then I started a blog to support this idea that I'm going to be, a schlock writer now. And I ended up having military.com reach out to me, and they wanted me to write for them, write about guns and gear and stuff like that. And I was like, yeah, sure, I'll give that a try. Why not? And also working at that same website was a former Navy SEAL named Brandon Webb. So we met there. We're both out of the service at this point. This was around 2011 or 12 that we met and started working together. And at a certain point, we realized, we were like, hey, you know what? Military.com has almost no veterans working there. They'll throw one or two on the board to be figureheads, but they have basically nothing to do with the military. They don't understand what we're trying to accomplish. So Brandon came up with this idea, let's start our own, news and information website, that does really have a focus on the special operations and intelligence community, and have it, be staffed by guys like us who actually did the job at some point. So that was kind of the initial impetus for it and how we got started. And, I'll avoid going into the whole backstory about, anybody who's ever started a small business knows the deal. You end up working for free for a long time. You have to pay your employees first. And it was a road to, build it up. And it actually got much bigger, much faster than I ever thought it could. And I have been a writer for the website, been an investigative journalist. I've been the managing editor and now the editor-in-chief. So by the time I graduated college in 2014, I was fortunate that I had a job lined up. I had helped build a job for myself, in conjunction with Brandon and some of the other guys at the company. In this era of, fake news controversy, I think the website does something special in that, we have actual veterans who served in the Marine Corps, in the Navy SEALs, in the CIA, in the Green Berets, who are writing about this subject, who have kind of transitioned over, and now they're writing about unconventional warfare or foreign internal defense and what's going on in Syria, what's going on in Iraq, and some things like that. And it brings a sort of tactical perspective from the non-commissioned officers, from the sergeants, that you're just not going to find elsewhere. Usually with these things, the people who are the anointed spokesperson for the military after leaving the service are usually generals, and they're usually talking heads on Fox News and Most of them have never even been in combat. Most of them are getting paid six figures to talk about stuff they don't have a clue about, quite frankly. So I think SOFREP has been kind of unique in that aspect over the last few years. As far as balancing OPSEC, I mean, yeah, it's a thorny issue. You always have to think about, what am I writing? Could this potentially hurt somebody overseas? OPSEC itself is a subjective term. It's not like classification where that word top secret is at the top of a document. You're read onto a program, you're read off of a program. So classified is pretty cut and dry. What is OPSEC? That's pretty subjective. I mean, there are people who think the type of shoelaces that Rangers wear is OPSEC. So, there's also the attitude of, when something happens, we as Americans and even as veterans, we think, well, the truth must come out. This paradox was very clear to me when Benghazi happened. You have all these people saying the truth has to come out, the truth has to be told. Okay, so I start investigating this, and but very quickly, you want to know what the truth is. The truth is going to involve what our government considers to be classified information. So at that point, I mean, yeah, quite frankly, you have to balance that and figure, well, what good is this going to serve if I report this? Is it in the vein of telling the truth? Is it newsworthy? Is it important? And if I report it, what are the possible detrimental effects? The job is to report the news, not become the news, not to shape international events. So these are all the things we have to think about. And I don't know that there's a cut and dried answer. I mean, at the end of the day, I'm a private citizen now. I don't hold the security clearance. I can write about Benghazi all I want. There's nothing to stop me. And for the most part, I did. But you also have to think sometimes, I think more in regards to sort of some of the stuff I report on, like Syria. I've reported on the U.S. Special Forces in Syria, for example. But some of the details I've omitted in those reports are things like where their FOBs are. Where are they staying at exactly? That's probably one of the things that you can leave out of the report and still tell the story without putting these guys in additional jeopardy. So that's my thought process on it anyway.
Yeah, there's obviously quite a bit of discretion involved, but you guys seem to navigate that pretty delicately. And I think what you also navigate delicately is that you're pretty nuanced and moderate politically. I think generally you guys avoid the identity politics game, sometimes to the point that you're even very critical of particular subsets of the population that are otherwise sort of infallible in the public eye. And you've probably been criticized by some of those groups and even internally within the military because of how, no one is off limits. Why do you think it's so important to expose the mistakes that military members make, even in a very chaotic and unpredictable work environment like combat?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I'm not interested in telling combat troops that they zigged when they should have zagged. I mean, I'm not trying to hold an AAR for their combat operation in Afghanistan from here in Manhattan. I mean, that's inappropriate, and it's not for me to look over their shoulder and be like, "Oh, you should have done this and you should have done that." It's not about armchair quarterbacking, but when you have other activities. Things that could be criminal activities, and the military is trying to sweep that under the rug and pretend it didn't happen. Now we're talking about something different. And I think the military is, they have quite a bit of hero worship around them these days. Yeah. And it's also a very insular community. It's a very closed off. I mean, special operations is almost like a little secret society within the military. And then within that, you have your little cliques and, your little enclaves. And so it can become very insular, very incestuous. There's quite a bit of groupthink, frankly, in some of these units. And things that shouldn't be acceptable can become perceived as acceptable over time. And I think that's also not necessarily a function of, the soldiers being bad troops, quote unquote, but just the fact that we've been at war for 16 years. I mean, guys get jaded, guys get burnt out. I mean, you're dealing with some pretty substantial PTSD and other issues at a certain point. And, some things do need to be brought to light. I mean, I was talking to one of my coworkers here today about a past story I wrote about a squad leader in the 101st who was actually raping his soldiers. He was sexually assaulting his soldiers. He was a serial predator in Afghanistan and also back stateside in Fort Campbell. And I mean, people were not happy with me for writing that. It's like I had a Ranger school instructor once tell me about, you might get negative peer evaluations because you're a good leader in Ranger school. What he meant by that, he said, if you have guys who are slacking off on patrol, and you're their patrol leader and you're putting a boot in their ass, they're not necessarily going to want that boot there. So they might speak out against you and say, hey, I don't like that guy. But that's all part of the job, and if you can't handle that, you don't like that, then you need to find another line of work, frankly.
No, it's cool to hear you say that, because I think people typically associate like the virtue signaling and the oppression hierarchy with the left, but it occurs on the right quite a bit too, where the military is used as that group that can never be criticized, and you want to be fair, but also when I think there are certain lines when they're crossed for the sake of transparency. Journalists have an obligation to report those things, and that seems to be where you guys stand on that. Now,
just interrupt real quick. When you say this, something else comes to my mind. It was the drug use in the SEAL teams. And that was something we reported on, and I reported on, and I was aware of, cocaine, methamphetamine abuse, all sorts of stuff going on. But you also, on the other side of that is, a certain amount of empathy that, these guys are probably self-medicating. They've been at war for over a decade. Maybe our government has some culpability here also, and that's part of the story. I mean, one of the things that I discovered, too, was that some of the docs were actually issuing some sort of upper, and I don't know what pharmaceutical that was exactly, but is it possible that they were being issued uppers overseas, some sort of stimulant to keep them awake during operations, and then they're addicted to that feeling, and they come home and they try to find, illicit substances to keep it going. And again, now that's another part of the story. That's a part of the empathy that I think you have to have for these guys, that they're trapped into this. They have some substance abuse problems, and our government is also, in the unit, has some responsibility there. So, I mean, it's not just about, calling out the guys. Sometimes there's a little bit more to the story.
Yeah, and I think it's just, the interpretation is what gives the information any kind of a value judgment. You're just reporting the information. And like you said, when it comes to some of these things, it could be emblematic of a much more systematic issue. It's not meant to blame anybody or to point fingers, but just to, again, recognize that, so that something is happening, and that it might not be just the individual in question that's culpable. It could be, like I said, a much bigger picture issue, and it usually is. It's never just one thing. And the idea that if you have a medical license, that gives you carte blanche to prescribe any kind of medication, but then somehow if someone self-medicates, that it's significantly different. I mean, I think that we need to be responsible as to how we prescribe these medications, because it can be a little bit of a slippery slope. And I think that was kind of where you were going when you reported some of these stories initially.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know way more about the medical side of it than I ever will. But I think what you hit on there that I totally agree with is that usually these issues are emblematic of something bigger, and that, when something bad happens, even like when something large scale, like a war, for instance, that's something we can easily kind of identify and look at. Wars don't happen for one reason. Usually it's a series of a dozen different things, a confluence of events that comes together and leads to that war. And I think that's a big flaw in journalism, that the causal chain is like this leads to this, and paints this very like simplistic black and white picture, when usually there's a number of things coming together that lead to an outcome.
Yeah, and I think you're getting a little bit into complexity theory, which is kind of where I want to go with the rest of the conversation. So I want to start by having you talk a little bit about the discrepancy between what the mainstream media and the government reports about some special operations missions versus the reality. So there was recently an incident during which 3 special forces members were killed inside of what was presumably a secure forward base in Jordan. So can you go ahead and discuss what actually happened compared to what was reported? Because it seems like SOFREP was the only media outlet that reported the incident accurately from the start.
Yeah, I mean, I had some sources talking to me, and I mean, I think we nailed that story. If I know I'm patting myself on the back a little bit, but But I think we nailed that story pretty good. And it's not something that I'm too pleased about. 3 Green Berets were murdered that day, but I think we came out very early on and we said this was a murder and called it what it was. These 3 guys, they were killed in cold blood. What happened was which air was it? Prince Faisal Air Base? I'm trying to remember now, but it was an air base in Jordan where the CIA was running one of their covert programs, training guys and proxy forces and sending them into Syria. Colloquially, it's just called the Interagency Mission. And these 3 Green Berets were assigned to that mission. They rolled in and out of that gate, on and off that base fairly often. And that day, as they came up to the gate like any other day, one of the gate guards opened fire with his AK-47, and he killed the 3 of them, injured a Jordanian officer who was also in the car, and then another special forces soldier shot almost fatally, but he seriously wounded the Jordanian Air Force security guard who had opened fire on them. And if you look at the reporting that the mainstream media did, I mean, I don't think that they deliberately or callously did anything like trying to report fake news. I don't think that's what they were doing. I think it comes from more of a lack of sources. And some of the stuff I was writing about that event and some other things that were happening in Jordan and Syria with special forces, I had a pretty well-known journalist at, I think it was the Washington Post, was hitting me up, and he was trying to get me to reveal my sources to him, and I was like, yeah, no, that's not going to happen. But I'd tell him, look, go talk to the guys in 5th Group and ask them what's going on. And what I realized out of that was the only people he was able to talk to were staff officers. And of course, the staff officers are like, everything's great, everything's going wonderful, right. Everyone's so happy, morale is so high in this unit.
Exactly.
So he wasn't. And I think that's true with a lot of reporters, that they want to talk to officers and they do not talk to the sergeants, and so they never really find out what the hell is actually going on the ground. A lot of times the colonels and generals, they don't really know what's going on. They have a kind of 30,000 foot overview of what the mission is and what they think is happening. But what their boys are actually dealing with on the ground, they typically aren't going to have much of a clue. So I think that's what leads to the discrepancy in that story between what I wrote and what others wrote. I'd also say Jim Moriarty, the father of one of the victims, also came out very strong very early on and was not letting this issue go. He was very clear early on, saying the Jordanian government is lying, because the Jordanian government had a series of 3 different cover stories. First they said the Green Berets tried to roll through the gate, they just tried to blow through the gate. And so the security guard opened fire trying to defend the base. That was the first story. That was proven false. Then the second story was that the Green Berets shot at them, also bullshit. Then there's another story about how one of the Americans had an AD. He accidentally discharged his pistol, which scared the security guard and made him think he was being shot at, so he started returning fire. That story is also not true. There was no AD. So the Jordanian government was trying to cover this up, and they have a pretty big incentive to try to do that because, King Abdullah and the government of Jordan is not nearly as stable as they try to present themselves. There's two cities in Jordan. One is very sympathetic to Al-Qaeda, and the other is sympathetic to ISIS. One of them, it's actually where Zarqawi came from, one of those cities. The other one is Man. Man is the ISIS sympathetic city where they actually fly the ISIS flag up on rooftops. And that's the city where the Air Force security guard who killed these 3 Green Berets came from. So this city has a history of militancy. So the government of Jordan has a sort of vested interest in covering up this event and making it seem like nothing bad is going on. They had another shooting at the big training center. There's another American who had been killed maybe 2 years previously, and by a Jordanian, and the Jordanian government said, oh, it was mental illness. It wasn't extremism. And I don't know what the case was there, but I'm just saying in another case, it's interesting how an American was killed in a military setting, and the Jordanian government's response to that was to try to whitewash it. So that was another thing that was being contended with, but there was also video. There's a CCTV camera that recorded the entire incident. So the Jordanian government, I think, had a pretty hard time whitewashing what went down. It's pretty clear, and the video has since been released. They held on to it throughout the trial. They didn't let anybody watch it during the trial. That was not used as evidence. But after the shooter was convicted, the Jordanian government then released the video, and you can go and watch it now if you have the stomach for it. It's not a pretty thing to watch. But on the other hand, I'm kind of glad that they did, because people can see that it was a cold-blooded, deliberate act of murder.
Yeah, and I think that like just what you're talking about speaks to what makes special forces so interesting and fascinating. And like you guys don't get to choose who you work with, right? So policymakers are determining what partner forces they think best champion U.S. interests, and as evidenced by the story that you just told, the policymakers often seem very detached from the reality on the ground. Where, like at least the case in Syria, as you reported, is that where we're arming what we're labeling as moderate fighters to help fight against ISIS. The supposed the most extreme of all these groups, but you've essentially reported that these moderates are actually extremists, and it's really more a matter of degree. And a lot of times it was the moderates that we're arming are affiliated with Al Qaeda, who at one time was the great nemesis, but they've kind of taken a back seat to ISIS, and it's really the slippery slope where we draw these arbitrary lines between what's moderate and what's extreme. So as an individual operator, was it difficult for you, at least when you were in, to sort of maintain a sense of purpose when you had no control over the people that you trained, equipped, and effectively entrusted your life to, or was self-preservation enough of a motivator?
I think in this respect, I was actually one of the lucky ones. I was teamed up with a Iraqi SWAT team in Tel Afar, and they were pretty good guys. I mean, of course, they have their ups and downs. There's one platoon that was not so great. The other platoon, which was pretty outstanding, actually. But there were quite a bit of good guys there. I was never really worried about my safety with them, fear that I'm going to be shot in the back. I never really had to worry about that. They're a good group of dudes, and I think, that has shown through in that when ISIS came to town, so many Iraqi security forces threw down their rifles and ran. The Tel Afar SWAT team has continued to fight through this entire thing. Even after Tel Afar fell, those guys kept fighting. They were fighting down in Anbar, down in Baji, in the Battle of Tikrit, in Mosul, and then back to Tel Afar just recently. I found out yesterday that one of the guys that I trained, his name was Abbas, was actually killed just north of Tel Afar fighting ISIS. So, I mean, those guys are pretty solid dudes. I mean, those are the Iraqi heroes that actually stood up and fought. So I personally was very fortunate in that regard that I didn't have to worry about that.
Okay. Yeah, because, it seems like that's not really the case so much now. So I'm just curious. I mean, obviously, self-preservation plays a huge role in it, but it's the whole, commander's intent. Like, if you know that the mission is kind of possibly doomed to fail, and you've got people who are very detached from the reality on the ground telling you, this is the strategy, this is what's going to win over the country, I would imagine it could be very difficult to
that's precisely what has happened in Jordan and in Turkey in this conflict with ISIS, was that there are special forces teams deployed to these two places, working under the auspices of the CIA to train, various Arab proxy forces to go into Syria and fight Assad and fight ISIS, or fight the Syrian Arab army under the Assad regime. Those guys, they came to the conclusion fairly quickly that most of these guys were either jihadists or they had sympathies. In Syria, there are so many sleight of hand type tricks that are going on. Just false fronts thrown up. This stuff that's barely disguisable, but the media narrative is such that I think the average American has such a hard time pulling through the information and judging which group is that. So, for instance, they'll have these reorganizations, so one group that's openly jihadi will merge with another, and now they call themselves, A lot of these groups sound like, like your high school garage rock band, like, Swords of Justice or something like that. And they'll rebrand themselves, and the rebranding happens like on a day-to-day basis. The reality of that conflict over there is that it's sort of like, how do I describe it? I mean, it's you have all these little groups, and they're all associated with each other and not associated with each other. On a day-to-day basis, on a battle-to-battle basis, they'll form a loose coalition and fight together. The next day, the coalition disbands, and they'll unite with another group to fight the group they'd been previously allied with. I mean, that was all very normal. When it comes to arming these groups, there's, again, sleight of hand tricks being used. They'll say, we're arming the FSA. But if you look at where the FSA operates, I mean, even big think tanks like Brookings, they can't determine where FSA ends and where Nusra begins. And Nusra is the Al-Qaeda affiliated group. So anywhere where you see these FSA groups, really what's happening is that they are nominally under the control of Al-Nusra. Al-Nusra has the power. They're the bigger, more dominant group. So FSA ultimately has to, bow down to Al-Nusra. And what they've been keeping Nusra open and Nusra has been tolerating and keeping the FSA going so that they have this false front of being, secular moderates, that, we're going to create some sort of like Jeffersonian democracy in Syria so that they can continue to maintain access to CIA supplied weaponry. It's just one of these, another, great historical blunders, something that'll be written about in the future. And historians will look at this and say, how could we be so stupid? And I think you'll have to look at a high level in the CIA and in the Department of Justice and the White House to totally answer that question. But, there are definitely people who should have known better and did know better, especially when there's Green Berets on the ground who are telling you, I don't know about this. And it goes back to your question of the difficulty of working with some of these groups, is that my understanding was that a lot of the guys on the ground have been deliberately dragging their feet because they don't want to be responsible for training al-Nusra terrorists. Right. So they're basically just digging their heels in and doing nothing, or sort of like passive resistance. What they teach us when we go to SEER school. Like, you're not openly defiant to your captors when you're in a POW camp. You're just kind of passively resisting. Like, someone tells you to do something and you say okay, but then you don't do it. Yep. That kind of thing.
Well, that's a case of using the government's training against itself. And I think what you're saying really speaks to just the complexity of this whole situation and how there are so many unknowns and there are so many assumptions that are being made from a policy standpoint without much data or precedent. And the war on terror is so politicized that even if you ask certain questions, whether it's on the right or the left, if you're deemed to be soft on terrorism, that's like political suicide. But because we can have an abstract conversation here, I feel like this is a question I have to ask. And it's not a leading question. It's one that I don't really know the answer to, but I'm curious about. As it stands now, it just seems like the strategy, whether it's in like Iraq, Syria, or Libya, is to remove these dictators or heavy-handed governments, sort of remove whatever semblance of stability is keeping these countries together, and then create these power vacuums and then train people or mold these indigenous groups where we're not sure if they're moderate or extremists, and then try to create these democracies and promote human rights. But there's a lot of factors going on that we don't understand. So if I'm a skeptic and I said, what would be wrong with leaving these dictators in place, because maybe that's what it takes to maintain some semblance of order in these parts of the world and keep the extremists and the terrorists from getting a foothold, would I be wrong, or am I completely off base to speculate that might be kind of a better policy? Because my thing is, like, if we don't really know what we're doing, then we better off just kind of leaving it alone and not being responsible for making things worse.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you say that, there's a certain group of people out there that are going to criticize you quite harshly. They're going to accuse you of being a Ba'athist or an Assadist or whatever other ist out there. Don't you love freedom, Doug? What's wrong with freedom? Come on. It's like that's kind of simplistic argument that people are going to make. But yeah, I mean, I think you're right. And that's an argument I've made in the past too. It's like, okay, look, if we have to choose between Assad and ISIS, which path are we going to go with? I mean, Assad is not a great guy. I mean, I've interviewed him. He's a nice guy in person, but his regime has done horrible things. They are a sort of autocratic regime that's based around the Assad family at this point, and has been for like 30 years, 35 years. But I mean, what's the alternative? If the alternative to Assad is total chaos, and it's a group like ISIS, or even a more, let's say, a more moderate Islamist organization like the Taliban, then no, we should not be removing these people, and we should not be even getting involved in these conflicts. There's no reason for American soldiers to go and die over there. I mean, what are they dying for? What's the end game? So yeah, I would say I have a bit more of a more nuanced, non-interventionist position against these things. But it's incredible that in America in 2017, there are all these journalists and these think tank people who run around advocating for regime change. It's uncanny. They want regime change in Syria. They want regime change in Iran. And it's like, yeah, thanks, guys. But look, you're not going to be the 18-year-old American soldier that has to patrol the streets of these countries and play global cop over there for decades. You're still going to be sitting in the Brookings Institute. You're still going to be sitting, you're going to be the editor of a newspaper somewhere. You're not going to have to deal with all the fallout. I mean, American soldiers fought, bled, and died in the streets of Iraq for like 10 years. I mean, how are you going to just cavalierly advocate for regime change in all of these countries? We've never had any kind of an end game. And it's one of my criticisms of Syria also. All these people talk about removing Assad and even fighting ISIS for that matter. Okay, that's cool. What's the plan for after ISIS? After ISIS, what happens? And I haven't seen anyone even try to answer that question. It's something that is so beyond our manner of thinking. Like during the debates, the presidential debates, that never even came up. It's about how much we should carpet bomb ISIS, and we're not thinking beyond that at all. And if we're smart about it, we can plan for the post-conflict environment and shape the political situation the way we want it. It's unbelievable to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think that some of these policies are based on the assumption that it's a dictator or a functional democracy, and I don't know if that's an assumption that can be safely made, or if there's any data that is indeed a correct assumption. So it's kind of a straw man argument where it's like, you're pro. It's not a matter of being pro Assad or pro Saddam. It's more a matter of, well, like you said, what's the alternative? And I think a lot of times when it comes to this sort of coin or counterinsurgency type strategy, it's never that the theory or of counterinsurgency it's flawed. It's always that, well, we're not doing counterinsurgency well enough. If only we'd put more money into it or more troops into it, then it would really work. But if that's what it takes, then maybe the theory itself is not practical. It's like, yes, if you threw an unlimited amount of resources at the problem, potentially this strategy would work, but that's not feasible politically or economically. So it's very sort of utopian,
Yeah, and every general wants more resources. I mean, that just goes without saying. But no, I think you kind of hit it on the head there. Counterinsurgency comes with a pretty big assumption attached, and the assumption is that the insurgency is illegitimate and that the government is legitimate, or vice versa, depending on the situation you're in. So, I mean, there's a big assumption built into counterinsurgency strategy that people want their government and that they dislike their government and that they want some kind of change involved. And we've learned the wrong lessons from history over and over and over again. And we would watch the Battle of Algiers in the Q course for like a case study on how to wage counterinsurgency. But I mean, the lesson that we probably should have taken away from that movie is that foreign peoples just aren't going to accept a American occupation force in their country. They're just not going to accept that idea. It's like when Jim Gant in Afghanistan would go to David Petraeus, and Petraeus would say, so what's it going to take to build Afghanistan into a nation state and form a federation of tribes and all this stuff? And, there were people in Afghanistan at that time that were like, listen, General Petraeus, that's never going to happen. But that wasn't the answer he wanted to hear. Not just him. It's not the answer that any of the Afghanistan commanders wanted to hear. So, and here we are all these years later fighting the same fight we've been fighting for, since roughly soon after 2001.
Yeah, and I mean, I think you and I both know how this conversation could be spun. And just to be very clear, I don't think either of us loses any sleep when ISIS gets bombed and there's less ISIS people around. But I think the idea that like just more bombing is going to create less terrorists, like I don't necessarily know if that is how to truly be hard on terrorism, if that's the word you want to use. In some ways, you can make the case that it creates more of a power vacuum for terrorists to thrive. And again, neither of us really know the answer, but I think to say that regime change is with absolute certainty the way forward, I think is also intellectually a little bit dishonest.
Yeah, it's very dishonest. And I mean, it's also, I don't think you need to be an expert on the region to look at our history of counterinsurgencies and our history of regime change in Libya and Iraq and our attempts in Syria. And like, look, we don't do this well. I had a friend who was a retired CIA officer, and he told me about the CIA. He's like, we don't do regime change well. And you could say about the United States military, we don't do counterinsurgency well. Policing foreign populations is just something we don't do very well. We're pretty good at infantry operations, the direct action mission. We're pretty good at that. But, doing like a deep dive into these foreign cultures, speaking their language, understanding their history, and nullifying insurgencies, we're not very good at that. And we should admit that to ourselves and admit that because of American culture and how we think, these things are unlikely to change anytime soon. I mean, 50 years from now, we're probably still going to be very bad at counterinsurgency. I also, you were saying earlier, and people say, well, the problem is that we don't do counterinsurgency right, that we don't have the right strategy, that we don't have the right tactics. And yeah, I think that's true. We could do counterinsurgency a lot better. But that also necessitates changes in our culture and how we think, and changes in our military culture also.
Yeah, for sure. Now, Iraq and Afghanistan are often regarded as similar problems. You've been to both countries and helped train some of the groups that are supposed to ultimately assume some of the security responsibilities. What do you think are the unique challenges that each country offers? And do you think the current Iraq and Afghanistan strategies reflect these differences fairly?
Well, yeah, they are radically different problem sets. I don't have as much experience in Afghanistan. I wasn't over there for a long period of time when I was in the military. Iraq, I've spent a decent amount of time over there, both in uniform and as a journalist. I think in Afghanistan, the primary problem, if I were to just give a thumbnail sketch of it, the primary problem is that Afghanistan has never really been a nation, and we're trying to create a nation there. We're trying to create a state. Instead, what you have is a very loose confederacy of tribes in Afghanistan. And, Afghanistan is also, Iraq is very cosmopolitan compared to a place like Afghanistan. I mean, Afghanistan is like, if you took away the AK-47, the cell phone, and the automobile, those people are living in the times of Jesus. And I don't say that to be insulting. I'm just saying, literally, you drive through a valley and it's like a woman wearing a burqa washing her plates in the stream. I mean, it's third world doesn't even begin to describe it. So I think that the notion that we were going to jump in there and create some sort of liberal democracy was beyond naive. I mean, that country is not far along enough in its political development to be ready for that. You can picture it's like, I mean, how would you compare it? Like, imagine some alien force coming to, America during the caveman times and thinking that they're going to create like a Jeffersonian democracy on this landmass. I mean, it's just not going to happen because the people there aren't ready for it. They have no institutional knowledge of that. When things change, these big paradigm shifts, you're shuffling a person's mental deck of cards. And it takes a society a while to wrap their mind around that. And I mean, Afghanistan is nowhere near ready for that. In Iraq, it bears some similarities. One of the biggest things is the Sunni Shia divide, the schism between the two. But it's also GOI in general. I mean, Iraq is a country where you could form a state, but there's so little trust in government. that it doesn't seem possible. And that mistrust is earned. The GOI has made a mess over there, and the corruption is just off the charts. So the people have no faith in their government, so they turn to their local loyalties like anybody else. Who can we rely on? Our family, maybe our tribe, but GOI. I mean, nobody looks to GOI and is like, oh, our government's going to come through for us. I mean, look how fast they folded in the face of ISIS. I mean, and I'll give you this isn't really a GOI example. There are many examples. Mosul you could use for an example, where the government forces threw down their guns, shed their uniforms, and ran for the hills. And ISIS is nowhere near what the media has projected them to be. I mean, we're talking about dudes cruising around with rusty AK-47s wearing flip-flops. I mean, there's nothing special about ISIS by any stretch of the imagination. And I've heard this over and over again from the Kurds I've talked to the U.S. Special Forces people I've talked to some of the foreign volunteers that just went over to the region and joined up with the Peshmerga or the YPG. I mean, ISIS is nothing special. They're just a bunch of thugs with AK-47s. But what it demonstrates is how unprepared and unwilling the Iraqi security forces are to fight a bunch of a ragtag militia. I mean, at Sinjar, the Peshmerga abandoned their positions and ran. When I found out that there was only Sinjar was a city of about 250,000 people, and it was attacked by 50 Hiluxes of ISIS people. Hiluxes being Toyota pickup trucks. So we're talking maybe a city of 250,000 people was sieged and defeated by maybe 150 ISIS fighters. And roll that around for a minute. Think about that for a minute. You start to understand how schizophrenic this region is and how shaky the institutions are. So, I mean, how do we repair it? I mean, I don't know if we can repair it. We may have to just accept that we broke Iraq, and we're going to end up with a Sunni state, a Shia state, and a Kurdish state. And maybe we just have to cut straight to the end game and accept that reality instead of trying to forge artificial states. I don't think that's a preferable move, because what it does is it weakens Iraq and it makes it more vulnerable to outside powers. Iraq was obviously vulnerable to the United States, and we took advantage of the situation and we made a mess. But the smaller, if we split Iraq into mini states and micro states, it means that it's going to be even easier for countries like Iran and Turkey or Saudi Arabia or whoever else to go mess around in there. So it's not a preferable option, but instead of spending, another 10 years trying to hold this thing together, maybe we just accept the reality. Like, one of my friends does security for a major news network, and he was in and out of Mosul the whole time. And he told me, he was like, Jack, like, the coalition is desperate to make it look like this is an Iraqi initiative retaking Mosul. But without the American support, this whole thing falls apart in a flash. I mean, it's distressing. And it makes you wonder what we're really accomplishing over there. And I tell people, I was like, look, we liberated Mosul, we liberated Tikrit, we liberated Ramadi, whatever. I mean, how many more times are these cities going to change hands in our lifetimes? We've already seen it happen a number of times, and it's going to happen again and again and again until there's some sort of stable government in this region that people believe in. And we don't see that happening. Yeah,
I mean, I think there's two separate questions. One is, how do you fix something after you break it, which is the really hard question, and maybe it's unfixable. But the other question, the one that's easier, is, all right, how do we not repeat the same mistakes going forward? And I think that's a much easier answer if we pay attention. But it hasn't happened yet, so I mean, hopefully it will. But I think this stuff is a lot more complex than we think that it is, and sometimes, like we discussed, maybe stability and just like leaving things alone, and not getting involved and making it our problem might be at least worst.
That's the swing back too. Is like we've seen in the last election and recent American political history is these people who say, look, America should pull out of all of our international obligations, pull out of all of these treaties, and just retreat back to Fortress America and take care of Americans first. And I mean, that's unrealistic. I mean, we can pull out of NATO, but then how long is it going to be before Americans have to die on French shores again? I mean, NATO is to stop the Europeans from killing each other as well as stopping Russian encroachment. I just throw that out there as one example. But I'm not advocating that sort of isolationism either. I think it's great to be hard on terrorism, but really, in my opinion, we should be smart on terrorism, and we just need to start thinking a bit more critically and thinking over a longer time horizon. At least think in terms of decades instead of these 4-year election cycles.
Yeah, no, I think, and that's a great point. Is that it's not about going from one extreme to the other and being completely isolation. It's about nuance and trying to draw more, I would say, appropriate boundaries versus falling, on one extreme versus the other, whether it's absolute regime change everywhere or not interacting with the rest of the world. I don't think either of those policies are particularly productive, and it's got to be somewhere in the middle, and it could be fluid, but at least, hopefully someone's having these conversations, because like we talked about, it seems like a journalistic trend where the extremes are comforting because they provide some certainty, but that certainty is more delusional than it is productive. Yeah. So we're running short on time. This is probably one of the denser discussions that I've had in under an hour, but how can people learn more about you and the work that you guys do at SOFREP?
Oh, geez. So, yeah, the website is sofrep.com, SOFREP.com. And you can see my work there, but also we have a lot of terrific writers on there working day to day, doing some great stuff. I have a personal website people can check out if they want. It's just called jackmurphywrites.com. I don't know anyone's going to be really blown away by that website, but hey, go for it. Take a look if you want. Yeah, let's see. We also we have a podcast we do twice a week called SOFREP Radio. People can take a look at that if they want. And yeah, that's it. I mean, through there, I think you'll be able to find everything you're looking for.
All right, cool. Well, thanks for your time, and we'll try to get together at some point in the future and maybe solve more of the world's problems, right?
Yeah, no, thanks for having me on, Doug. I mean, like you said, this is like a super, super complicated subjects that you've been mentioning here, and we could probably stretch any one of these things out for an entire episode.
Yeah, well, thanks again for your time. You did a great job with the limited time that we have.
Yeah, no, thanks, Doug. Anytime.
All right, take care.